Welcome back, Daniel. How was Park City?
It was great. Thanks for asking. The skiing was nice and the company was even better.
Well, sounds like a pretty good time. So, what are we talking about today?
Today, I want to talk about equity slash ownership versus cash compensation from the employer's perspective as well as from the employee's perspective, investing in company stock, and then the challenges of delegating to a new employee.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, interesting. So we got sort of compensation slash equity, company ownership value, enterprise value, and then delegation. Do you have a complaint to file about Olivia or something?
No, I'm all right. Just got my head thinking of a lot of things recently. So, first on the equity or cash compensation question, let's start from the business owner's perspective. So, from a business owner's perspective, I want to more focus on like a smaller business. So, just for the audience and for my understanding, when I say equity or buying in a small business, what does that actually look like and mean?
Sure. So you see kind of two different universes for this, and you're pointing at a small business, but I'm going to kind of point at a business that you may not think of as a small business, which would be sort of like a tech startup, and then I'll point at more of like a professional business, like a law firm or an accounting firm. So, in tech startups, you see a lot of equity compensation in lieu of salary because often they're not profitable. And because they're not profitable, they have a limited cash reserve from their investors and they're trying to preserve that as much as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to pay people equity in lieu of cash compensation. Now, some people are still paid really well in startups, 100,000, 200,000 for like software development or something like that. But often they might warrant much greater compensation at a company like Apple or Amazon in terms of salary or equity options there. And so you often see equity as an early type of compensation, particularly stock options, where essentially the employee is going to have the right to buy into the company at a fixed price later on. And if the company is going from a small startup to a big startup to go public one day or get acquired someday, that can be super valuable. But there's capital at risk. Conversely, in more professional services organizations, buying into a partnership or becoming a partner in something like an accounting firm or a law firm is more or less conventional in certain circumstances, where, to some extent, because all the value of the organization or of the company comes from the human efforts of its individual professionals, it's very common to become a partner, or whether that's as a full equity partner, where you actually have voting and profits, or whether you become a partner sort of in name only, where you might have a more generous bonus structure, but you don't actually own the company in a particular sense. So you sometimes have multiple classes of quote unquote citizenship when it comes to equity ownership in small businesses. And then last, there's just sort of the mom and pop, right? I bought my mom and dad opened the company and they're leaving it to me or letting me buy into it or they're gifting it to me at some point. And that's a whole different family dynamic issue.
All right. So, first, focusing on the tech side, you said that equity can be offered in more of these startups or maybe areas where there isn't a readily available cash flow for a salary. So, does this come with decision making power typically, or is this just equity compensation?
That's going to depend case by case. I'd say normally no decision making power unless you are like the first engineer, the first specialist in something they're bringing in, where not only are they bringing you in to actually like create the product or create the platform or whatever it is, but also if they're doing that and they're bringing you in, they probably don't actually know much of what you know. And so you may have much greater say in, user interface, user experience, the design palette, where things live, how the database works, etc. But if you're, let's say, software engineer number 10, you're probably, going to have some sort of equity compensation or equity option grants or something like that, but you probably don't have as much of a say in like the direction of the company per se.
All right, and then transitioning to say the service based businesses, so maybe a law or accounting firm or even a financial planning firm or whatever the case may be. I don't love the word deserves, but who quote unquote deserves or earns the right to equity at a certain point in time?
It really depends on the stage that it's happening in. A lot of firms will offer equity to retain people. That's kind of the biggest thing here is if you become a partner, an equity owner of the company, you become a fiduciary as an owner to the company itself. And so, in that law firm and that accounting firm, you often see sort of equity being offered when you're irreplaceable or when the loss of you would be too great to manage. Take even an example like Mad Men, right? One of the early plot things that happens in season one, spoilers, everybody, is Don Draper's offered, I think, 12.5% partnership in the company, and the I think it's Sterling Cooper originally, and they do that because Don Draper is this big hotshot creative, and they want to make sure they retain him because his brand equity is so valuable in the marketing world. But in turn, that creates certain obligations and makes it harder for people to come and go. And so the question of deserves is tricky in small businesses. I think the misuse of it is for loyalty, actually, ironically. I think it becomes much more important when that person or the contributions that person makes are irreplaceable. Alternatively, I think sometimes it's okay to open the door. Right here in our local community, we have a place like Left Hand Brewing, which has been employee owned, at least in part, for decades at this point. You have places like the Pump House, which is employee owned, where the company has decided to increase loyalty over time, but also to improve the longevity of the organization. They want to make it employee owned, and it becomes more of a co-op structure than it was originally when it was just owned by one or two people to start.
I'm sure, and you got me thinking about this when you mentioned the 12.5% with Mad Men. But at a small firm, is there an amount that's considered giving out too much and relinquishing too much control at a certain point with in regard to equity?
I think it really depends on what that irreplaceability factor is. So, like, let's take our firm, for example. There's no intention at this time to just start handing out equity one day or to make equity compensation part of the structure, but there's an intent to go ahead and allow the firm to become more employee owned over time, particularly as we get to a stage where, my presence in the practice is less necessary for its existence and it becomes more important for the survival of the practice and the long term health of the practice that the senior folks in the firm have more of a buy-in and more of a stake in the organization to keep it going past my own, removal or retirement or whatever it could be. At the same time, let's say we were going to decide we were going to do tax prep services, which we have no intention of doing at this time. Well, I don't have that experience. You don't have that experience. Emily doesn't have that experience. And we could try to hire somebody in to do that. Like we could just post a job for a senior tax accountant with 5 to 10 years of experience and pay them really well. But we're always going to have a material risk to the business, which is that person is just a W 2 employee. And that person, if they decide they want to walk on February 1st for any reason at all, we have no ability to deliver on that line of business. So then equity for somebody in that sort of situation makes more sense in the sense that then they're more tied to the company. They have a greater incentive to stay and run that line of business and grow that line of business. And so there's strategic decisions like that where you need somebody that you can't buy or where buying is not sufficient, where you can't really pay enough in wages to make it worth it for them to stay. And the risk is so great that when they might leave that you want to give it. So I think a lot of people are very flippant with their equity when it's worthless. You see a lot of people just saying like, hey, let's be 50-50 partners. Or, I hired one person, I'm just going to give them 10% of the company because they're here. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because equity today may not be worth very much, but equity long term might be the most valuable thing, bar none, in the entire organization. So, I think in regards to your question, how much is too much? I think any amount is too much unless it's adequately attuned to the necessity of the person you're giving it to. Or in turn, if you're selling it, then that's a different conversation. But in that sense, there's a really big component here about at what point do you sell majority versus minority and how much value is there in minority positions versus majority positions.
Okay, so let's transition then to the employee side of the equity conversation. Let's say there's an employee at a service-based business who thinks they deserve and have been doing things that were quote unquote irreplaceable and they're extremely valuable to the firm. Is it more or less like asking for a raise and role and responsibility? I guess how would you go about that conversation and navigating that process with your employer?
So, to some extent, you have to acknowledge that when you start asking for equity in compensation, whether it's the opportunity to buy in, whether it's just the hey, I'm awesome and you can't live without me, so you should give me equity or let me buy in equity. You have to understand that you're sort of making a bit of a tacit threat, because the tacit threat here is I want equity somehow, and if you can't give it to me, you are openly stating or showing me that I'm you don't think that I'm worth it. So it's sort of a challenging thing, because when you go to ask your employer for equity or you say I want to buy in or whatever the case is, you're putting them in a position to disappoint you or offend you, because you may think more highly of your capabilities than the employer does, or you may think you're more necessary or essential than you actually are. So that's the first thing to just recognize is when you go to that. I mean, it's sort of like proposing to your partner. There's only two outcomes. They're going to say yes or they're going to say no. And if they say yes, that's great. And if they say no, we're in a tough spot. So that's one thing to just contemplate is when you're going to go ask for it, you've got to be really certain of what the answer is going to be. The second thing that comes into that then is that good contracts make for good partnerships. You can have a soft conversation about it once or twice. Past that point, you've got to start getting things in writing. You've got to start setting timelines, measurements, KPIs, whatever the objective measures are going to be of how this is going to happen, if this is going to happen. Because at least in financial planning land, the career landscape is just littered with the corpses of bad succession plans, where literally thousands of financial planners out of college, career changers, whatever it is, have gone to work for a firm, and the firm owner said, I'm getting up there in years, and I think you're going to be the next generation of this firm. And a decade later, they're like, cool. It's like, when is that going to happen? The owner's like, someday. Like, I've been here for a decade. What do you mean someday? Right. So there's an element here where if you're asking for equity on day one, that's a bold strategy. I hope it works out for you. On the other end of it, you can't wait forever to get an equity grant or have an equity conversation if it's important to you. But also just be mindful that equity is not just ownership and it's not just a share of the profits. Equity is also a material responsibility and a material liability that can be a really double edged sword.
Okay, so let's talk about that. From the employee's perspective, they might just be thinking, I want to share in the profits of this profitable company. And they might not be taking into consideration some of the other factors, like how they might have to be responsible for the trajectory of the firm moving forward, or if they have a bad quarter, and also sharing those potential losses, and maybe even buy in from a monetary perspective. From the employee's perspective, what are some of the things they might be overlooking or things they have to consider?
Well, first and foremost, again, you're purchasing some ownership, you're purchasing some shares. If you're in the minority shareholder standpoint, which you're probably going to be in the minority shareholder standpoint, you have to recognize that your control is actually sort of meaningless. It's symbolic, because until you either have 51% or there's enough different owners that you can create a coalition of 51%, you're never going to win a vote. So you can either agree with the majority shareholder or the majority shareholders, or you have to get to a point where there's no longer a fixed 51+% owner in the firm who ultimately is going to get to make the final decision every time. So that's just one thing, is you might be buying status, but not control. The second thing that comes up then is sort of the material risk, is just the liability factor. Let me invoke Mad Men again. So spoiler warning again for anybody who wants to go see that. But a couple seasons into Mad Men, they decide that they get acquired, and then they decide they're going to escape, and they form a firm called Sterling Cooper Draper Price. Well, the Price in that four-man name doesn't actually have the money to buy in, just cash on hand. And so he sells his portfolio to fund his buy in for the new firm. And in doing so, he has a bunch of taxes. And long story short, he steals from the firm to pay the taxes and gets caught. And as a result, they essentially say, you violated your responsibility to the firm, you're out. Right. So a capital call is a thing that can happen in a firm where we say, hey, we're expanding the firm. Hey, we are growing the firm. Hey, we've decided that we need more cash reserves. So the partners need to pony up in proportion to their ownership. So if we say we need $1 million and you're a 10% owner, congratulations, you need to pony up 100 grand. And if you can't pony up the 100 grand, somebody else will pony it up. But they either get to then buy your ownership, or they get to dilute your ownership proportional to your inability to fund your obligations as a partner. So there can be a real money out of pocket risk, and there's liability. Right? If you are an owner of this company, and let's say you're 25% owner, and the company really screws up and gets sued for $1 million, okay, and there's a judgment of $1 million, you get to pay a quarter of that judgment, right? And you might have errors and omissions or something, but let's say it's something that wasn't insured for. Well, again, you're going to have to pony that up, or somebody else is going to have to cover your part, and you're going to end up getting diluted out of it or bought out of it as in turn for that. So there's a lot of risks to ownership that occur, and there's also just elements of agency, right? When you're an owner, you have an absolute agency obligation to the firm, right? When you start thinking about something like, I'm not happy here, I want to go somewhere else, I want to do something else, you have a fiduciary obligation to the firm and to the partners of that firm. And so you can entertain that a little bit, but if it starts getting serious, you are in breach of your agency when you start contemplating leaving or selling your share or doing something else if you don't disclose that and get involved. So, there's a quote I put when I teach the equity unit in the retirement planning class up at CU, and the quote is, golden handcuffs are still handcuffs. Equity is valuable, but they are golden handcuffs, and you have to be mindful that they are attaching you to this entity or this organization in a serious way.
I'd say the majority of people also wouldn't consider themselves either entrepreneurial or people that are interested in owning a business. I'd assume you might have to have a little bit of a conversation with yourself, if you want to become a business owner, because most people don't, and it sounds like you in part become a pretty heavy part of the business and are going to be involved in a lot of those decisions depending on the scope of the partnership.
Well, that's a big thing. You also have to recognize G1 ownership versus G2 ownership, right? The original owner founders and the new people. Most firms struggle and suffer to get off the ground. If you go back and listen to podcasts from, I think, early November, I did a solo podcast explaining that literally starting this practice about 2 years into it, this almost killed me. I mean, it got that bad. And so, in that particular context, there tends to be a chip on the shoulder of the original founders and owners about like the struggle and the effort they put in, and sort of then what can sort of be perceived as an entitlement attitude for the second generation, saying like, "Well, I want to buy in," and sort of the de facto attitude of a lot of founders is like, "Sure, you want to buy in, or sure, you want to get equity, but like, what have you done?" You show up to nine to five just like I do, but what risk did you take? This company exists, it's profitable, your paycheck has been paid from day one. So like, what do you actually bring to the table? And I think that is probably the most critical thing in a small business context. Whether it's a small professional firm, whether you're the eldest son wanting to take over the print shop, or like whatever it is, you've got to really ask, what are you bringing to the table in this relationship beyond just the fact that you're a good employee, right? And in that particular sense, what risks are you taking on? I think when a lot of people think about being owners, they just sort of jump to kind of a classic, capitalism versus Marxism thought, which is like, I just want a share of the profits, I want a share of the upside, and that makes all the sense in the world. We all want to have some level of self-interest, but you do have to contemplate that ownership is not all sunshine and roses. At the end of the day, a business is the most demanding child you could ever have because its needs are never sated, and its needs will supersede the other things in your life. So when it's good, it's great, but when it's bad, it's awful.
Well said. All right. So let's transition a little bit to just investing in company stock, whether it's a smaller company or a larger company. As financial planners, we love to speak about diversification and not putting all your eggs in one basket. However, to play devil's advocate a little bit, you could probably make a good argument that if you're a business owner, you know more about your business than anything else. Like you said, it's almost like the most needy child you'll ever have. Can you make the argument that investing back into your business is a considerably better way for you to build wealth than maybe diversifying and out of your company stock or somewhere else?
So there's an old expression which is concentration builds wealth, diversification protects wealth. Small business ownership, small private equity, any version of entrepreneurship is going to be the highest potential ROI activity you can do. So if you're a doctor, opening your own credit clinic is going to be more profitable long term than just working at your local hospital. Hanging your own shingle as a lawyer is going to be more profitable than just working in somebody else's law firm. That's pretty much always going to be the case long term. Short term, there might be huge differences, right? That hospital might be offering you $500,000. Starting your own clinic might be a money loser for years to come. So in the context then of wanting to kind of buy into the company or purchasing company stock, concentration becomes a little bit of a risk in that, if I'm a small business owner and I don't ever diversify out of my company, I don't have a 401k that I'm funding, I don't put money in a Roth IRA or a brokerage account, I don't really have much savings outside of the company because it's profitable, it's always been profitable, I'll always just have a paycheck from the company. Well, then at the end of that, I have a couple of risks. One is, can I sell it? And if I can't sell it, two, will the company run if I leave? And if the company will run when I leave, how much does it cost to replace my effort in the company? And as a result of replacing myself in the company, how much does that cut into my take home and profit? So there's a lot of risks there just on sort of a founder owner side, let alone then being an employee buying into that company.
Okay, and how do you kind of weigh the emotional aspect of it? You know, if this is a company you've been working for a while or own in some way, you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and you know so much about it and know the people personally. I'm sure there's an emotional tie to investing there versus into, you know, a bunch of tickers and areas where there's no emotional advantage or tie at all.
Sure, and in that particular sense, that's where home bias is really a problem. So take stock out of it for a second. Take private companies out of it for a second. Think about somebody like a realtor. It's very common for realtors to obviously make all their money helping people buy and sell houses, but also to then invest their money in buying houses and selling houses or having rentals. Part of that is just because when they buy it, they get a commission. So then they're sort of like, my investment kind of sort of paid for itself. Cool. But your entire income is derived from transactions in the real estate market. And if all of your income is derived from that and all of your assets are also tied up in that specific market, then that means if that market takes a big hit, not only did you lose a lot of your income, you might have lost a lot of the equity value or property value that you had previously. So there's a risk to concentrating there. Now somebody has, and I've heard plenty of people try to turn that around and be like, well, you're an investments guy, and so if you're just investing in the stock market, you're doing the same thing. Yeah, kind of. But also, I'm investing in every company that's publicly traded in the United States and around the world. So there's a diversification level there that is different. But in that sort of proxy or that particular extension, you have to then contemplate scenarios like Enron, right? Everybody working at Enron was doing great until they weren't. Look at big companies, right? Netscape was a big company at one point. AOL was a big company at one point. WorldCom was a big company at one point. So it's easy to have your home bias and say, like, I can affect the outcome. But when we're talking about Fortune 500 companies, big, ginormous companies, no, you can't. And also, even in small businesses, I used to teach Dr. McGillivray's one of his classes every semester over at Front Range, and I would always use his liquor store as an example. I'd say Dr. McGillivray has a successful liquor store. It's doing well. It's been growing revenue. It's all that's wonderful and great. But the day that Colorado passes a law saying that every grocery store can sell liquor and beer and wine the exact same way that other businesses do, then that's going to be a big issue because in other states, grocery stores can sell, but in this particular case, it can't.
Would you say there's maybe a percentage or a time in your life when it makes sense to start doing the, as you said, grow your wealth versus protect your wealth thing?
I think you have to contemplate the scenario that you should always be thinking about growing your wealth and protecting it simultaneously. So as you start to, when you're young, take all the risk in the world, right? Take that startup job, buy, super aggressive stock only portfolios, et cetera. Don't go crazy. Don't borrow a lot of money or something. But when you get past that point, then it becomes important for you to consider that long term, the core outcome that we're going to get to is going to be a scenario in which you want to protect your downside probably more than you want to increase your upside, because unless you have really ambitious goals, you probably just don't need that much money, right? If anybody who's gotten to, let's say, 3, 4, $5 million is probably good for the average American. And if you are going to risk your 3, 4, $5 million in the hopes that you're going to get to $20 million, what's driving that? Like, what's really the outcome we're trying to accomplish here?
I like what you said there about preserving and building the wealth at the same time. And I think that kind of encapsulates the conversation. I wouldn't say it's that easy. You know, if you have a business or buying into a business and investing in this business, you know, you want to do it while simultaneously also looking for opportunities to maybe protect it and diversify elsewhere.
Well, and there's also the question of how you got it, right? Some people worked for it, some people inherit it, some people it's just sort of pennies from heaven, right? They just had a job and then there was some equity stuff and the company suddenly gets acquired and they're millionaires overnight. Like there's a lot of different stories about how that can all happen. But from the standpoint then of kind of what it means to you, you've got to be really thoughtful about like what is the outcome. We've referenced somebody on this podcast before in regards to them sort of being maybe a little bit upset that they're not maybe going to be responsible for the financial success they have in their life because they have a family member who's been very successful, who gifts them a lot of money, who's probably going to gift them a ton of money down the road, or let them inherit a chunk of a very successful family business. And they struggle with the kind of identity crisis of not having been self-made in that sense. But we return to sort of the question we like to ask clients. is the reason that we're saving and investing, is the reason we're working, all of that to provide our greatest sense of self fulfillment and then to die on a pile of gold like we're a dragon? Or is it because we want to fund the lifestyle and the needs that we have day to day, but also to provide for the ability to spend time with our family, to have the trips and travels and experiences that we want in this finite period of time that we have called life? And if your objective is to die on a pile of gold like a dragon, cool, go for it. But if the objective was to fund the lifestyle of your family and provide for them, and then to give yourself more freedom and time to spend time with them and have meaningful experiences, who cares how you get there, right? If it's high salary, great. If it's a lot of equity stuff, great. If you inherit it, congratulations and lucky you. But at the end of the day, the core question becomes, what is the outcome? If concentrating your wealth is necessary to attain the outcome, okay, keep the risks in mind. And if you already have enough to provide for the outcome, stop taking risks that aren't necessary.
All right, so let's say we speak with a business owner and they're working 60 plus hours a week, 70, whatever the case may be, and they want to work less. And they come to us and say, my goal isn't to spend all day working in this business. I actually want to tone it down a little bit. So they want to start delegating as a business owner. It's not uncommon for us to hear people say that. And then when push comes to shove, be very reluctant about actually starting to delegate, uh, even though we can mutually agree that it's in their best interest. Is this really a challenge for a lot of business owners and something you could speak to even?
It is, because the challenge as a business owner is that you're always probably the best at that thing. And so you always run into this thing where you're like, well, I could hand this off to Tony and it'll take him an hour, or I could do it in 10 minutes. So I should just do it. And you can do that forever, but there's so many things that only the owner can do, and there's so many things that anybody can do. And so any smart business owner should be, as soon as it's feasible, trying to delegate as much as possible that only or sorry that anybody can do, and trying to retain only not only the things that they can do, but then even in that context trying to figure out how they can only do the parts of that that they're good at and enjoy doing, and trying to figure out, okay, supposedly only I can do this, but if we got to a certain size or a certain scale, I could hire that chief marketing person or that chief legal person or whatever it is and delegate that as well, and trying to map that back into how they're growing and developing the business.
Do you think it's just a skill thing? Like I can do this in 10 minutes, but it might take you an hour? Or are there other factors? For example, maybe it's a trust thing, or simply you've been doing this thing and it's almost like your baby, and giving it up feels like you're giving up a part of yourself almost.
I don't know that it goes quite as far as that for a lot of it. I'm sure it does for some folks, but I don't think it's that serious. I think where you bring in trust is a big factor, which is that when I hand this to you, I'm trusting that you're going to get it done, and I'm going to have to eat the consequences if you don't, because I trusted you to do it. But as the owner, I ultimately have to take all responsibility at the end of the day for the outcomes. That's where I think, having a really thorough training process, but also giving your team very clear instructions is helpful. And I think also creating a culture and having a set of values around ownership, around, doing things right and so on is really important. And also not punishing people for making mistakes, but correcting them and training them, right? There's a difference between somebody who you need to let go because they're just a malcontent or because they're not doing their work. That's one thing. But when somebody makes a mistake, they probably didn't make that mistake intentionally. And I think a lot of companies make a mistake of saying, oh, you messed up one time, you're demoted, you're punished, your pay is cut, whatever. And that's just demoralizing and defeating because they didn't mess up intentionally. So on the other side of that, as a small business owner, or even as just a manager who's getting a bigger team, you have to acknowledge that there will be mistakes, and nobody is making those mistakes intentionally. All mistakes on your team fundamentally become a training issue and a leadership issue that you have to take responsibility for.
So let's say you are in a management or leadership position and you're training or delegating to a new employee. If you're in a position where you provide them feedback, is this something you want to do? Or I guess, how often are you providing both positive and corrective feedback?
So you have to have fairly regular formal feedback, right? So this is your quarterly review, your monthly check-in, whatever you want to format it as. I think companies that do an annual review are missing huge opportunities because essentially you're just giving people a grade at the end of the year, and they're going to either agree with it or disagree with it. And a year is a really long time because people have sort of this "what have you done for me lately" sense of things. So that's sort of problematic to do big annual reviews. On the other side of that, then I think you have to give feedback very immediately and where possible, because if you try to sort of hold on to like a list of problems and grudges and you just sort of dump them in the lap of your team every quarter or twice a year or whatever it is, there's a question here of, okay, could I have fixed this? Could I have done this better? There's times where you sort of have to just bring up a mistake that was made, a couple months ago during that quarterly review, whatever it is. But on the other side of that, my number one rule when it comes to feedback for quality of work is you give it immediately. And if you find yourself complaining to somebody, so like I'm having lunch with you or Emily, and I'm talking about whoever's not in the room during that lunch, and I'm like, ugh, Daniel, he just doesn't get this thing. I feel like he's messing this up quite a bit. The problem with doing that and then not immediately going to you and saying, "Hey, Daniel, I just talked to Emily about this, and this issue came up," is that I'm setting an unspoken expectation for you because I've talked about it, I've internalized it, but you don't know that I'm giving that feedback to somebody else about you, and you can't correct or adjust your behavior from that context. So it becomes really important that feedback is timely, whether it's positive or corrective, so that we either know that was great, keep doing that, okay, or hey, that wasn't quite right, we need to fix that ASAP so we don't keep repeating the mistake.
Do you think there's like a mix of for every two negative or corrective things that I say I should also provide a positive to uplift as well?
No, there's a whole thing, a whole bunch of stuff about like compliment sandwiches where it's like, hey, the bread on one side, good thing, meat in the middle, terrible, bread on the other side, like positive. People know when they're doing a good job. People know when they're doing a bad job, and if they don't know, it's because they have no way to know. And you just need to give it to them straight in that particular context. Now, if you're giving bad feedback after bad feedback after bad feedback, that is demoralizing, and you've got to try to find some space to give them some positivity or recognize it. But at the same time, if you're giving bad feedback after bad feedback after bad feedback, that's probably a you problem as the leader or the manager, not a them problem as the employee, unless they're so far along the continuum that they're actually being malfeasant or just screwing around at work and they're just absolutely messing up and knowingly doing so.
Okay, so whether it's consistent negative feedback or maybe just, hey, this is a new role and this is a lot of new to me. As a manager or leader, how do you also start to help them build confidence while you start to delegate all these new things that they might mess up on?
Yeah, I mean, you have to give them the safe space to make the mistakes, so you don't delegate anything that can't be broken. And when it's time for something that can't be broken, you supervise it and make sure that it doesn't ever go south until they're completely comfortable with it. But by extension, from that part of that training and feedback cycle has to be constructive. It has to be, hey, you did it this way. I want to see it this way. Here's how we get there. And then you have to give them whatever support and training is necessary to get from A to B, and then it's on them to do it. So you can monitor whether you're giving them enough support and feedback and whether they're listening and taking it or whether they're not. But in that particular sense, right, there's an element where at the end of the day, you still own the outcome. So when you're giving them that feedback, you're giving them that training, you're trying to move from A to B, whatever the circumstance is, you have to give it enough due consideration. And if there's something that cannot go wrong, right? It's a trade, it's a piece of client advice, it's a deliverable with a deadline. Then you have to ensure that you have a check-in to make sure that it gets done, recognizing that between point A and point B there could be mistakes or omissions or errors. And again, they're not going to be intentional. But you have to give yourself enough runway and leeway to catch those and fix those in time.
Excellent. So sounds like just creating and encouraging an open space, not only to make mistakes, but have that communication on a pretty consistent basis.
Well, and communication is all there. And the last thing that I'll just put in this topic is just because somebody does it differently than you doesn't mean they did it wrong, right? There's a little bit of a control freak in every business owner that we all have a perfect vision of how we want things to look at a certain point. But just because we are excited for it to be one particular way or another does not mean that it has to be that way. There's plenty of great ways to accomplish the same thing. So, in that particular context, you have to be mindful that your feedback is not criticizing somebody's style versus somebody's substance.
Well said.
All right. Well, I think you've picked my brain on all three topics you brought to the table today. So, as is tradition, I'm going to turn it around on you. Daniel, in your 2 weeks of skiing and also working, week by week dependent, what is the thing you have learned that you want to share with the audience that you think is beneficial for them?
You know, what's funny is something about planes. I get very productive, and it's always a very unique use of time. On the way back from Park City, it's about a hour and 45-minute flight to Denver. and I spoke to the lady next to me pretty much the entirety of the flight. And a decent amount of that was her sharing her personal finances and stories and whatnot. And it made me think and start to think about this concept of people who engage in financial planning. It's one thing to know you need it, right? And most people can see a glaring need if they have one within their finances, but that's not the only reason and the only uh, driver for engaging in a financial planning relationship and the impetus for change. In addition to that, there has to be an emotional drive to move you forward. There's a lot of people that have guilt, shame, embarrassment, and they don't want to move forward, even though they know they need it, and they're just not willing to apply it to their life yet. And that's something I've started to internalize a little bit. It's more than just, hey, you have a financial need here. Let's have a conversation. They have to be in a emotional place where they feel comfortable having that conversation, and sometimes that takes time.
Yeah, I was just say there's a whole great pile of research, theoretical theory of change, for example. There's all sorts of things about how people go through cycles of becoming aware there's a problem or a thing that needs to be fixed, recognizing that they need to take action, how they decide to take action, whether they follow through on that action, and then going through a cycle then of did that create the change that I needed for that problem to go away. And a lot of people struggle with between the step of recognizing a problem and making a commitment to make the change to fix that problem. So it's a very valid observation of yours that a lot of people have issues, but at the same time they're just not ready to take action. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.